Hello, welcome to RajaReads. I'm Masood Raja, and today in my series on academic and scholarly books, I would like to introduce you to probably one of the 5 most significant books of late 20th century, and that is Edward Said's Orientalism. Edward Said's Orientalism. Now, Said was a Palestinian Arab scholar of literature and spent most of his career at Columbia University. His first major book actually was about Palestine, and it's called A Question of Palestine, and it is probably one of the best books published about Palestinian people and their struggle. Orientalism is a huge book, not because of what's in it, but also because of the impact it has had over different branches of study: history, anthropology, sociology, and of course literary studies. And it has also invited a lot of criticisms, some merited and some without merit, but a book that even after 35 years of its publication is still talked about and still causes a lot of scholarly conversations. So what is it about? In Orientalism, Said is trying to answer quite a lot of questions, but the main question that he's trying to answer, which he refers to in one of his interviews, is the question as to why is it that when, let's say in America or even in Europe, the Orient, which we call Middle East, is mentioned, people have certain predisposed ideas about the people who live there or the kind of culture that exists there, mostly negative. And what Said is trying to explore is, how does that view of the Middle East come to be, right? Now, Orient for him isn't the Far East. He explains in the introduction that by Orient he means the contemporary Middle East, mostly the Islamic world. So what Said suggests in the book, and the book is very easily organized. There are 3 chapters. There is an introduction, and then there are just 3 long chapters. Chapter 1 is the scope of Orientalism. Chapter 2 is Orientalist structures and restructures. And Chapter 3 is Orientalism now. So Said's project in the book is what he calls Orientalism. He explains it by using Foucault's theory of discourse, and he mentions it in the introduction. So what he's suggesting is that Orientalism is a discourse perpetuated over 300 years of European scholarship. These were the people who produced knowledge about the Orient, who wrote plays, stories, travelogues about the Orient. There were colonial administrators who incorporated that knowledge and then perpetuated the policies informed by that knowledge. So overall, Orientalism is a discourse that creates Middle East, the Middle East or the Orient, as Europe's other, this dark other, highly sensualized, sexualized, and creates a group of people who can be given designations of being brutal, being uncivilized, being mystical, without really actually knowing the people themselves. So Orientalism is that discourse that enables Europeans to designate the Arabs or the Middle East as these primitive people, people without history, people not living in serial time as if they live in an ossified time. And based on those assumptions, then these people can be considered a subject race, a race to be managed, a group to be managed, right? All of this process of creating the Orient into this other that can be colonized, that can be managed or controlled, is what he calls a process of Orientalism, that Orientalism makes it possible in material reality for these things to be done. So one thing you will notice as you read the book, and a lot of people criticize the book for it, that not a lot of native voices are heard in the book. It's all about how Europeans wrote about the Orient, represented it, thought about it, made policy about it. So the Orient itself comes across as a very passive place, and people criticize Said for that. And I think that's unjustified criticism, because in the very beginning, in introduction, Said tells us that what he's trying to study is this discourse produced by Europeans, implemented by Europeans, which constructs the Orient a certain way. That is his object of study, and not the native resistances. Of course, if you read Culture and Imperialism and Said's other works, there is a fully detailed and sophisticated account of native resistances, both semiotic and material. But the project in Orientalism is to study the discourse of Orientalism, how it is constructed, how the poets use it, how the administrators use it, what impact does it have on the political consciousness of European leaders, and how does that then create policy in the Orient, right? That is what he's trying to study in this. Now, I do have a detailed series on my other channel where I'm recording word by word, page by page, the book itself, and then discussing it. I think we have finished the introduction and some parts of chapter 1, so I highly recommend that you go to Postcolonialism channel and look at the playlist for Orientalism. But as a book, if you ever want to read a book that introduces you to not just 300 years of cultural production about the Middle East, and all the major French authors and the British authors, but also a book that tells you what political role that knowledge, its production, its dissemination played in the Orient in the first 2 chapters. And then in the final chapter, what is the role of American scholars and politicians in the current phase of Orientalism? This is the book that will enable you to actually learn all those things. Now, in the beginning, I mentioned that this book changes fields of studies, but it also inaugurates fields of studies, right? My field of study, postcolonialism, would not be possible without Orientalism. Said is considered one of the leading scholars of postcolonial studies. It also changes historiographic studies, because suddenly there is interest in history, in not just representing it as Europeans or Americans see it, but how the natives themselves tell their stories. In anthropology, for example, Said's intervention forces anthropologists to study native cultures of the colonized spaces from the point of view of the natives. So overall, a book that still unleashes various kind of debates, a book central and very important to postcolonial studies, but a book that any reader who is interested in reading elegant prose that deals with a highly complex subject of knowledge production about one of the most significant parts of the world, the Orient, which we call the Middle East. This is the book to read, because not only would it enable you to understand how Europeans and Americans view the Arabs or the Middle Eastern people, but also why do they view them like that. But beyond that, you will also learn how other discourses work, right? How patriarchy works, how race relations work. How is it that a dominant group cannot just only have power, but they have the institutions of knowledge production, dissemination, TV, books, journals, universities, and how knowledge usually defaults on that dominant structure, right? And so that's what Orientalism teaches us, besides the actual historical figures that he mentions and the writings that he discusses. So most importantly, the thing to keep in mind is that this is not a work of history, even though history is in it. It's a work of literary scholarship by a scholar who's trying to help us understand as to how or why the Europeans and Americans now see the Orient, the Middle East, a certain way, even before they've met anyone there or even before they have visited there. And that preconceived view of the Middle East and the Islamic world is what Said is suggesting is made possible or underwritten by Orientalist discourse, by Orientalism. So that's all I have to introduce this book. I do hope you read it. And if you do, let me know what you think. And I'll try to answer any questions that you might have. Not too complicated questions, because I cannot answer them in the comments. But overall, thank you so much. I hope you're staying safe. Take care of yourself and those around you. And I will now see you next time. Until then, peace and love.